When a mute Civil War veteran witnessed a powerful rancher threatening a defenseless widow in broad daylight, everyone expected him to look away like the rest of the town. But Jacob Morse had spent 5 years in silence, and he learned that sometimes the loudest statement comes without saying a word. What he did next would force an entire community to find their voices and change the balance of power in Arizona territory forever. But would his act of courage cost him everything he had left to lose? The sound of gunfire split the morning air like thunder, but it was only Jacob Morse practicing his aim behind the old oak tree on his ranch. His hands shook as he lowered the pistol, not from fear but from the nerve damage that had plagued him since a Confederate sword nearly took his head off at Antietam 5 years ago. The bullet had missed the tin can by 3 inches. Again. Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, frustrated by his body's betrayal. The autumn of 1867 had been harsh in the Arizona territory, and winter was coming fast. He needed to be able to protect his small herd of cattle from wolves and rustlers, but his trembling left hand made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The scar across his throat itched in the dry desert air. He touched it gently, remembering the day he'd lost his voice forever. The Confederate officer had been young, maybe 19, with scared eyes and a shaking sword. Jacob had tried to surrender, raising his hands and opening his mouth to speak the words that might have saved them both. Instead, the blade had found his throat, and he'd fallen into darkness with the taste of blood and the sound of his own voice drowning in his chest. Now 5 years later, he lived alone on 40 acres of scrub brush and stubborn dreams. His closest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, a widow who ran a small chicken farm 2 miles east. She sometimes brought him eggs and tried to start conversations, but Jacob's silence made her uncomfortable. People in Millbrook treated him with a mixture of pity and unease, as if his inability to speak might be contagious. Jacob holstered his pistol and walked toward his small wooden cabin, his boots crunching on the dried grass. The structure was simple but sturdy, built with his own hands after he'd used his army pension to buy the land. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch where he sat most evenings, watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and leather. A single photograph sat on the mantel, his company from the war. 12 young men who'd believed they were fighting for something important. Jacob was the only one still alive, the only one who'd made it home to discover that home was now a place where words held no meaning. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to always be brewing and sat at his small kitchen table. A piece of paper lay before him, covered in his careful handwriting. It was a letter to his sister in Pennsylvania, one of dozens he'd written but never sent. How could he explain his life to someone who remembered him as a laughing boy who could charm birds from trees with his stories? The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of another lonely morning. Jacob had developed routines to fill the silence, checking on his cattle, mending fences, reading books by candlelight. But today felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't name. He needed supplies from town. His flour was running low, and winter was approaching faster than he'd expected. The ride to Millbrook would take an hour, and he'd have to endure the stares and whispered conversations that followed him wherever he went. But the alternative was starving, and Jacob had survived too much to die from pride. Outside, his mare whinnied softly as he approached with saddle and bridle. The horse was getting old, her gray coat showing signs of age, but she was reliable and gentle. Jacob had bought her from a cavalry officer who was leaving the territory, and she seemed to understand that both of them carried invisible wounds from the war. As he rode toward Millbrook, Jacob noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The air smelled of rain and change, and something in his chest tightened with anticipation. He'd learned to trust his instincts during the war, and they were telling him that today would be different from all the others. The town appeared in the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings connected by dusty streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could see people moving about their daily business. Children played in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying on the wind like music he could barely remember making himself. Jacob's throat tightened as he remembered the boy he'd been, full of words and dreams and the absolute certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. That boy had died in a field in Maryland, But something of him remained in the man who now rode silently toward whatever fate awaited him in Millbrook. The mare's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth, and Jacob found himself thinking about courage. Not the kind that came from speeches and battle cries, but the quiet kind that got a man up every morning despite the weight of his burdens. He'd been practicing that kind of courage for 5 years, and today he had the strange feeling he was about to discover what it was really for. The scream that pierced the morning air made Jacob's mare rear up on her hind legs, nearly throwing him from the saddle. He fought to control the frightened animal while scanning the street ahead, his heart pounding with the familiar rush of danger. 20 feet away, outside Murphy's General Store, a woman in a torn blue dress was backing away from a man whose shadow fell across her like a dark promise. Marcus Valdez stood 6 feet tall in his polished boots, his silver belt buckle catching the sunlight like a warning. His black hat sat perfectly on his head, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points that made his smile look like a blade. He was the kind of man who owned things, land, cattle, people, and his presence in Millbrook always meant trouble for someone. "Please, Senor Valdez," the woman pleaded, her voice thick with an accent that spoke of Mexico and hardship. "I told you, I need more time to gather the money. My husband's death left me with nothing but debts and—" Elena, Valdez interrupted, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Your husband made a bargain with me. The fact that he died before paying doesn't change the terms." He stepped closer, forcing her to press her back against the store's wooden wall. $43, plus interest. That's what you owe. Jacob dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. He recognized Elena Morales, now the Mexican woman, who'd married Tom Harrison, a young homesteader who'd tried to make a life for his family on worthless land. Tom had died of fever 3 months ago, leaving Elena alone with 2 small children and a mountain of debt. "I don't have $43, Elena said, her chin lifting with a pride that Jacob found both admirable and dangerous. "But I can work. I can clean your house, cook for your men, anything." "Oh, I have ideas about how you can work off your debt." Valdez's hand moved to Elena's face, his fingers trailing along her cheek in a gesture that made Jacob's stomach turn. "But it won't be cooking or cleaning." A crowd had begun to gather, but Jacob noticed how they kept their distance, how their eyes found interesting things to look at on the ground or in shop windows. Fear had a smell, and it was thick in the air around Murphy's General Store. "I am not that kind of woman," Elena said, her voice stronger now but with a tremor that suggested she understood exactly what kind of danger she was in. Valdez laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Every woman is that kind of woman when she's desperate enough. And you, my dear Elena, are very desperate indeed." Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his throat, feeling the raised scar that marked him as different, as broken. In the war, he'd been a corporal, responsible for other men's lives. He'd given orders, made decisions, used his voice to rally soldiers in the face of enemy fire. Now he was just another silent observer, watching injustice unfold without the power to speak against it. But silence didn't mean helplessness. Elena's basket of goods had fallen to the ground when Valdez first cornered her. Potatoes rolled in the dust, and a small bag of flour had split open, creating a white cloud that hung in the still air. Jacob could see her children's future in that spilled flour, hunger, cold, and the terrible choice between starvation and surrender. "I'll give you until tomorrow night," Valdez said, his hand moving to Elena's wrist and gripping it hard enough to make her wince. "Come to my ranch after dark, and we'll discuss your payment plan in private." "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "Then I'll have the sheriff seize what little you have left. Your cabin, your husband's tools, even the clothes on your back." Valdez's grip tightened. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm offering you a chance to keep your home and feed your children. All you have to do is be friendly." The crowd shuffled nervously, but no one stepped forward. Jacob understood their fear. Valdez owned half the county and had the other half in his pocket. Sheriff Morrison was a weak man who preferred to look the other way when powerful people misbehaved. Standing up to Marcus Valdez was a good way to find yourself ruined, run out of town, or worse. Elena's eyes swept the crowd, looking for someone, anyone, who might help her. Her gaze landed on Jacob, and for a moment he saw something in her face that hit him like a physical blowhole. She was looking at him as if he might be the answer to her prayers, as if his silence might somehow become her salvation. The irony was bitter as medicine. A woman who desperately needed someone to speak for her was turning to a man who couldn't speak at all. Jacob felt the weight of every eye in the crowd, felt the familiar shame of his disability, mixing with something else, a anger that had been building for 5 years, fed by every injustice he'd witnessed in silence, every moment when his voice might have made a difference. Valdez noticed Elena's gaze and turned to look at Jacob with amusement. "You expecting help from the mute?" he asked, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "He can't even order a drink at the saloon without pointing and grunting like an animal." The words hit Jacob like physical blows, but he'd heard worse. What made his hands clench into fists was the fear that flickered across Elena's face as she realized that her last hope was a broken man who couldn't even defend himself, let alone her. But as Jacob stood there in the morning sun, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations and his own limitations, he began to understand something important. He might not be able to speak, but he could still choose. He could still act. He could still be the man he'd been before the war, took his voice but left his heart intact. The question was whether he had the courage to step forward into the kind of trouble that might cost him everything he had left. Jacob's boots hit the wooden sidewalk with a sound like thunder, and suddenly every conversation in Millbrook stopped. The crowd turned to stare as he walked toward Valdez and Elena, his weathered face calm but his gray eyes burning with something that made grown men step back. His right hand hung loose at his side, ready, while his left trembled slightly from the old war wound that had never quite healed. "Well, well," Valdez said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "The silent hero decides to join us. What's the matter, Jacob? Finally found something worth grunting about?" Jacob stopped 3 feet away from Valdez, close enough to smell the man's expensive cologne mixed with whiskey and sweat. He looked directly into Valdez's eyes, and something passed between thema recognition of danger, like 2 wolves sizing each other up before a fight. Elena pressed herself against the store wall, her dark eyes wide with fear and hope. "Please," she whispered, though Jacob wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to God. "My children are at home waiting for me." Jacob's throat worked silently, the way it did when he tried to speak, and nothing came out. The familiar frustration rose in his chest, but instead of backing down, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the one that held every dollar he'd saved from selling his cattle the month before. The crowd murmured as Jacob opened the pouch and began counting coins into his palm. $1, $2, $5, $10, $20. The silver pieces caught the sunlight, each one representing a week of hard work, a month of careful saving, a future he'd planned for himself. "What do you think you're doing?" Valdez demanded, his voice losing its smooth confidence. "This is between me and the woman. You have no business interfering." Jacob held up one finger, the universal sign for wait, then continued counting. $30, $40, $43. He held the money out to Elena, but she shook her head. "I cannot take your money," she said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "You don't even know me. Why would you help a stranger?" For answer, Jacob pointed to his throat, then to his heart, then to Elena. The message was clear to anyone who cared to understand. Some things were more important than words, and protecting the innocent was one of them. "You simple fool," Valdez snarled, his hand moving to rest on the handle of his gun. "You think throwing money at this problem will make it go away? You think I'll just walk away because some mute cowboy wants to play hero?" Jacob's eyes never left Valdez's face as he pressed the money into Elena's hands. Her fingers were cold and shaking, but she held tight to the coins as if they were pieces of hope made real. "This isn't about money anymore," Valdez continued, his voice rising so the whole crowd could hear. "This is about respect, about knowing your place in the order of things. You can't just ride into town and think you can change how business is done around here. Mrs. Patterson, the chicken farmer who sometimes brought Jacob eggs, stepped forward from the crowd. She was a small woman with gray hair and hands that had worked hard all her life, but her voice carried clear across the street. "Seems to me," she said, "that Jacob's business is his own, and if he wants to help Elena, that's his choice to make." "You stay out of this, Martha," Valdez warned, but more people were beginning to move. Dr. Stevens, the town doctor, pushed through the crowd with his black bag in hand. Behind him came Bill Morrison, the baker, and his wife Sarah. Even young Tommy Chen, who worked at the telegraph office, was inching closer. Jacob noticed something else. Sheriff Morrison was nowhere to be seen. The man who was supposed to protect the people of Millbrook had made himself scarce when trouble started, leaving them to face Valdez without the law's protection. "You all think you're very brave," Valdez said, his eyes scanning the growing crowd, "but you forget who owns the bank that holds your mortgages. You forget who controls the water rights and the shipping contracts. Cross me, and you'll find out how quickly your comfortable little lives can fall apart." The crowd hesitated, fear flickering across their faces. These were ordinary people shopkeepers, farmers, families just trying to get by. They had everything to lose and nothing to gain from standing up to the most powerful man in the territory. But Jacob had already made his choice. He stepped between Valdez and Elena, his stance relaxed but ready. His message was clear. If Valdez wanted to get to her, he'd have to go through him first. "You're making a big mistake," Valdez said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've got 20 men working for me, and half of them would kill you for the price of a drink. You think your silence makes you mysterious? It just makes you an easy target." Jacob smiled then, a slow, sad expression that somehow made him look more dangerous than any threat could have. He'd been shot at by Confederate soldiers, had his throat cut by a man who wanted him dead, and had lived 5 years in a world that treated him like he was less than human. Marcus Valdez was just another bully, and Jacob had stopped being afraid of bullies a long time ago. Elena clutched the money to her chest, her eyes moving between Jacob and Valdez. "The debt is paid," she said, her voice stronger now. "I owe you nothing more." "The debt was just the beginning," Valdez replied. "Now you've made this personal. You've embarrassed me in front of the whole town, and that's not something I can let slide." Dr. Stevens stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "Marcus, you've got your money. Elena's paid what she owed. Time to let this go." "Is it?" Valdez's hand moved closer to his gun. "Or is it time to teach this town what happens when people forget their place?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jacob could feel the crowd's fear, Elena's desperation, and underneath it all, his own quiet certainty that this moment had been building for 5 years. Every injustice he'd witnessed in silence, every time he'd walked away from trouble because he couldn't speak up, all of it had led to this street, this morning, this choice. But as he stood there facing down the most dangerous man in Arizona territory, Jacob realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore. The crowd hadn't scattered. They were scared, but they were still there, still watching, still ready to see what happened next. For the first time in 5 years, Jacob felt like he might not be fighting this battle by himself. The thunder that rolled across the Arizona sky 3 days later sounded like cannon fire, and Jacob Morse was mending fence when he saw the riders coming. 5 men on horseback, moving fast across the desert toward his small ranch, their dust cloud rising like smoke from a funeral pyre. He recognized the black stallion in the lead before he could make out the rider's face, and his hands went still on the wire he'd been stretching. Marcus Valdez had come calling, and he hadn't come alone. Jacob set down his tools and walked to the center of his yard, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. The storm was building fast, dark clouds piling up like mountains in the western sky, and the air smelled of rain and electricity. His rifle hung on pegs inside the cabin, 30 yards away. His pistol was in the barn, closer but still too far to reach before the riders arrived. He'd known this moment would come. Men like Valdez didn't forget public embarrassment, and they didn't forgive challenges to their authority. The only question was whether Jacob would face what was coming with dignity or try to run like a rabbit. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a line that blocked any escape route. Jacob recognized two of them, Pete Hawkins and Billy Crane, drifters who'd hire their guns to anyone with enough money. The other two were strangers, but their hands rested easy on their weapons, marking them as professionals. "Afternoon, Jacob," Valdez called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Beautiful day for a ride, don't you think? Though it looks like we might get some weather." Jacob stood perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides. He'd learned patience in the war, had spent long hours waiting for the enemy to make the first move. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his life might depend on reading the intentions of dangerous men. "You know why I'm here," Valdez continued, walking closer while his men remained mounted, their horses forming a loose circle around Jacob. "You made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. That's not something I can let pass." Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the ground. Jacob's mare whinnied nervously from the corral, sensing the tension in the air. The chickens had already fled to their coop, and even the insects had gone quiet. "I'm a reasonable man," Valdez said, stopping 10 feet away. "I don't want to hurt you, Jacob, but I can't have people thinking they can challenge me without consequences. You understand that, don't you?" Jacob's throat worked silently, the way it did when he tried to speak. The familiar frustration rose in his chest, but he pushed it down. Words wouldn't save him now, and they'd never been his strongest weapon anyway. "Here's what's going to happen," Valdez continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man explaining simple facts to a child. "You're going to get on your horse and ride out of the territory. Tonight, you're going to leave everything behind and never come back. And if anyone asks, you're going to tell them you decided ranch life wasn't for you." The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dust with tiny puffs of impact. Jacob felt one hit his hat, then another on his shoulder. The storm was moving in fast, and with it would come wind and rain that might change everything. "Of course," Valdez added, his smile turning ugly, "there's another option. You can stay and face the consequences of your actions. But I don't think you'll like how that story ends." Jacob looked at each of the mounted men in turn, memorizing their positions, their weapons, their body language. Pete Hawkins was nervous, his horse dancing under him. Billy Crane looked bored, like this was just another day's work. The strangers were alert but relaxed, professionals who'd done this kind of thing before. "Nothing to say?" Valdez asked. "I suppose that's your natural state, isn't it? Silent as the grave." The irony wasn't lost on Jacob. Here he was, possibly facing the last moments of his life, and he still couldn't find his voice. But maybe that was fitting. Maybe silence was his destiny, and he'd been fighting it for 5 years when he should have been learning to use it. "Boys," Valdez said, turning to his men, "I think our friend here needs some encouragement to make the right choice. Help him understand the situation." Pete Hawkins dismounted first, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Sorry about this, Jacob. Nothing personal, just business." Jacob's muscles tensed, ready to move, but he forced himself to remain still. Rushing toward armed men was suicide, and he'd survived too much to throw his life away on a hopeless gesture. If this was going to be his last stand, he wanted to make it count. That's when he heard it, the sound of more horses approaching from the east. Many horses, moving fast across the desert floor. Valdez heard it too, his head snapping toward the sound, his confident expression flickering with uncertainty. "Expecting company?" Billy Crane asked, his hand moving to his rifle. "No," Valdez said, his voice tight with suspicion. "No, I'm not." The riders emerged from the rain like ghosts, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth. Jacob's heart leaped as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Morrison, his badge glinting even in the stormlight. Behind him rode Dr. Stevens, Mrs. Patterson, Bill Morrison, the baker, and at least a dozen other townspeople, all armed, all wearing expressions of grim determination. "Afternoon, Marcus," Sheriff Morrison called out as he reined in his horse. "Seems like you're a long way from your own property." Jacob stared at the sheriff in amazement. Morrison was a weak man who'd spent years looking the other way when powerful people misbehaved. What had changed? What had given him the courage to ride out here with a posse? "This is a private matter, Sheriff," Valdez said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "No concern of yours." "Funny thing about that," Dr. Stevens said, urging his horse forward. "Had a visitor this morning, Elena Morales, with her children. Seems she had quite a story to tell about threats and intimidation." From his position in the center of the yard, Jacob watched the balance of power shift like sand in the wind. Valdez's men were outnumbered now, and their horses were getting spooked by the thunder and lightning. The professional gunmen were calculating odds, weighing risks, preparing to abandon their employer if the situation turned ugly. "Elena came to me yesterday," Sheriff Morrison continued, his voice carrying more authority than Jacob had ever heard from the man. "Said she was afraid for her life, afraid for her children. Said Marcus Valdez had threatened her with things that would make decent people sick to their stomachs." "You can't prove anything," Valdez snarled, but his hand had moved to his gun. "It's her word against mine." "Maybe," said a new voice, and Jacob turned to see Tommy Chen, the telegraph operator, riding up with a piece of paper in his hand. "But this telegram from the territorial governor might change things. Seems there's been complaints about you, Marcus. Lots of complaints." The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust to mud and making it hard to see. Lightning crackled overhead, and Jacob could feel the electricity in the air, could sense that everything was about to change. But as he stood there in the storm, surrounded by people who'd come to help him, Jacob realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore. The silence that had defined his life for 5 years was finally being broken, not by his voice, but by the voices of others who'd chosen to stand with him. The question now was whether courage would be enough to face what was coming next. The gunshot that split the air came from behind the barn, and everyone froze as the echo rolled across the desert like a death sentence. Jacob's eyes snapped toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized they'd been outflanked. More of Valdez's men had been waiting, hidden, ready to turn this confrontation into a massacre. "Nobody move," a voice shouted from the shadows. "First person who reaches for a gun gets a bullet." Sheriff Morrison's hand stopped halfway to his weapon, his face pale in the stormlight. The townspeople's horses danced nervously as more gunmen emerged from their hiding spots behind the water trough, inside the old shed, even from the tall grass near the fence line. Jacob counted at least 8 men, all armed, all pointing rifles at the people who'd come to help him. "You always were too trusting, Morrison," Valdez said, his confidence returning like water flowing back into a dry creek bed. "Did you really think I'd ride out here with just 4 men? I've been planning this for days." Tommy Chen's horse reared as a gunman grabbed its bridle, nearly throwing the young telegraph operator to the ground. The piece of paper he'd been holding fluttered away in the wind, lost to the storm that was building overhead. Whatever news he'd brought from the territorial governor was gone now, scattered like dust. "Here's how this is going to work," Valdez continued, drawing his own pistol and pointing it directly at Jacob's chest. "You're all going to dismount, nice and slow. Then you're going to lie face down in the mud while we have ourselves a little talk about respect and consequences." Dr. Stevens, his weathered hands steady despite the danger, spoke up from his saddle. "Marcus, you're making a big mistake. You can't just murder half the town and expect to get away with it." "Can't I?" Valdez's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Who's going to stop me? Morrison here couldn't catch a cold if he tried. And the nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride away. By the time anyone comes looking, you'll all be just another sad story about settlers who couldn't handle frontier life." Rain was falling harder now, turning the yard into a muddy mess that would make fighting or running nearly impossible. Jacob could feel the water soaking through his shirt, could see the fear in the faces of the people who'd risked everything to stand with him. Mrs. Patterson looked smaller than ever on her horse, her gray hair plastered to her head by the rain. Bill Morrison, the baker, kept glancing at his wife, as if memorizing her face for the last time. But it was Elena Morales who surprised everyone. She'd ridden in with the group, staying back until now, but suddenly she spurred her horse forward, her dark eyes blazing with fury. "You want to talk about respect, Marcus Valdez?" she called out, her voice cutting through the rain and thunder. "What about the respect you owe to my husband's memory?" What about the respect you owe to every woman in this territory who's had to endure your threats and your wandering hands? Elena, get back, Sheriff Morrison warned, but she ignored him, her horse dancing closer to Valdez despite the guns trained on her. You think you're so powerful, she continued, her voice rising. You think you own everything and everyone. But you know what? You're just a scared little boy who never learned that real strength comes from protecting people, not hurting them. Valdez's face went red with rage. Shut your mouth, woman, or I'll. You'll what? Elena interrupted. Kill me? You were planning to do that anyway. At least this way, everyone will know what kind of man you really are. Jacob watched this exchange with growing amazement. Elena had found her voice, her courage, in the face of certain death. She was doing what he'd never been able to do, speaking truth to power, using words as weapons against a man who'd terrorized the territory for years. But her bravery was about to get her killed. Valdez raised his gun toward Elena, his finger tightening on the trigger. I've heard enough from you, you Mexican. The word died in his throat as Jacob moved, not toward Valdez, which would have been suicide, but toward the nearest gunman, a nervous-looking kid who couldn't have been more than 18. Jacob's war-trained reflexes took over, and he dove low, tackling the young man around the waist and sending them both crashing into the mud. The kid's rifle went off as they fell, the bullet going wide and striking the barn wall with a splintering crash. Suddenly, everyone was moving, horses rearing, people shouting, gunmen trying to get clear shots in the chaos. The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury, and rain came down in sheets that made it nearly impossible to see. Jacob wrestled with the young gunman in the mud, both of them fighting for control of the rifle. The kid was strong but inexperienced, and Jacob's years of hard ranch work had kept him tough despite his age. He managed to wrench the weapon away and roll clear just as another shot rang out. Through the rain and confusion, Jacob saw Sheriff Morrison finally draw his gun and fire at one of Valdez's men. Dr. Stevens was helping Mrs. Patterson down from her spooked horse while Bill Morrison tried to shield his wife from the crossfire. Tommy Chen had somehow gotten hold of a pistol and was shooting back at the gunman, his face set with determination that surprised everyone who'd known him as a quiet telegraph operator. But it was Elena who turned the tide of the battle. Instead of seeking cover like everyone else, she rode her horse straight at Valdez, screaming something in Spanish that Jacob didn't understand but that made the rancher's face go white with shock. Her horse collided with his, and both animals went down in a tangle of legs and flying mud. Valdez rolled clear and came up with his gun, but Elena was faster. She'd grabbed a fallen rifle and was pointing it at his chest, her finger on the trigger and death in her eyes. This is for Tom, she said quietly, speaking of her dead husband. This is for every woman you've hurt. This is for every family you've destroyed with your greed. Elena, don't, Dr. Stevens called out, but his voice was almost lost in the storm. Jacob struggled to his feet, the borrowed rifle heavy in his hands. Around him, the battle was winding down. Most of Valdez's men had either been shot or had thrown down their weapons when they realized the fight wasn't going their way. The nervous kid Jacob had tackled was sitting in the mud with his hands raised, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. But the real drama was playing out between Elena and Valdez, two people whose hatred had been building for years, finally facing each other with nothing left to lose. You won't shoot me, Valdez said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. You're not a killer, Elena. You're just a frightened widow who got in over her head. Elena's smile was cold as winter moonlight. You're right about one thing, Marcus. I'm not a killer. She lowered the rifle slightly. But I'm also not afraid of you anymore. Thunder crashed overhead, and Jacob realized that the storm was beginning to pass. The worst of the rain was moving east, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and somehow new. As he stood there in the mud, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, he understood that something fundamental had changed in Millbrook today. The question was, what would rise from the ashes of the old order? The morning sun painted the courthouse steps gold as Jacob Morse climbed them slowly, his best shirt pressed and his hair slicked back with water from the basin. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at his ranch, and today Marcus Valdez would finally face a judge for his crimes. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the heavy wooden door, not from his old war wound this time, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Townspeople who'd never spoken to each other sat side by side, united by their shared experience of standing up to a tyrant. Elena Morales sat in the front row, her children beside her, their faces serious but no longer haunted by fear. Dr. Stevens had saved her a seat, and Jacob nodded his thanks as he settled in. Judge Harrison Waters was a stern man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by anything. He'd ridden in from the territorial capital specifically for this trial, bringing with him the authority of federal law and a reputation for fairness that even Valdez couldn't buy. "This court is now in session," the judge announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "We're here to hear charges against Marcus Valdez for attempted murder, assault, extortion, and conspiracy. How does the defendant plead?" Valdez's lawyer, a nervous man from Phoenix who kept wiping sweat from his forehead, stood up. "Not guilty on all charges, Your Honor. My client is an upstanding citizen who's been the victim of a conspiracy by disgruntled townspeople." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Judge Waters silenced it with a look. "We'll let the evidence speak to that. Prosecutor, call your first witness." Jacob's heart hammered as his name was called. He'd never been inside a courtroom before, had never imagined himself as a witness in a criminal trial. The idea of standing before all these people, unable to speak, made his throat tight with familiar anxiety. But Elena reached over and squeezed his hand. "You don't need words to tell the truth," she whispered. "Your actions already did that." Jacob walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like wooden posts. The bailiff, a young man with kind eyes, held out a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Jacob nodded and placed his hand on the book, feeling the weight of all the promises he'd ever made. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen who'd traveled from Tucson, approached with a gentle smile. "Mr. Morse, I understand you cannot speak due to a war injury. Is that correct?" Jacob nodded again, his fingers moving unconsciously to the scar on his throat. "The court has arranged for Dr. Stevens to help translate your gestures, with your permission. Is that acceptable to you?" Another nod. Dr. Stevens stood up from his seat and moved to a chair beside the witness stand. For 30 years, he'd been the only doctor in Millbrook, and he'd learned to read people's needs without words. He was the perfect choice to be Jacob's voice. "Mr. Morse, please tell the court what you witnessed on the morning of October 15th, outside Murphy's General Store." Jacob's hands began to move, painting pictures in the air that Dr. Stevens translated into words. The story unfolded slowly but powerfully: Valdez's threats against Elena, the crowd's fear, the moment when Jacob decided he couldn't remain silent anymore. "Objection," Valdez's lawyer interrupted. "This is all hearsay. How can we trust the translation of gestures? There's no way to verify what the witness is actually saying." Judge Waters leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Jacob. "Mr. Morse, are you able to write?" Jacob nodded and accepted the paper and pencil the bailiff brought him. His handwriting was careful and clear, each letter formed with the precision of a man who'd learned to communicate without sound. "I saw Marcus Valdez threaten Elena Morales. He said she could pay her debt by coming to his ranch at night. He touched her face and grabbed her wrist. She was scared. Everyone was scared. I gave her my money to pay the debt, but he said it wasn't about money anymore. He wanted to hurt her because she was Mexican and alone." The judge read the note aloud, and a hush fell over the courtroom. Simple words, written in careful script, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. "Continue with your testimony, Mr. Morse." For the next hour, Jacob's hands told the story of that terrible morning and the confrontation at his ranch. Dr. Stevens translated faithfully, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. When Jacob described how the townspeople had ridden out to help him, several people in the courtroom wiped tears from their eyes. Elena was called next, and her testimony was like fire. She spoke of years of harassment, of threats whispered in dark alleys, of friends who'd been driven from their homes for refusing Valdez's demands. Her voice never wavered, never broke, even when she described the moment she'd almost shot the man who'd terrorized her family. "Why didn't you pull the trigger?" the prosecutor asked. Elena looked directly at Valdez, who sat at the defendant's table with his head down. "Because Jacob Morse taught me something that day. He showed me that real strength isn't about hurting people who can't fight back. It's about protecting them, even when you're scared, even when you can't speak up for yourself." One by one, the townspeople told their stories. Mrs. Patterson spoke of threats against her chicken farm. Bill Morrison described pressure to buy supplies only from Valdez's stores. Tommy Chen revealed telegrams that had been intercepted, messages that would have brought federal attention to the territory if they'd reached their destinations. Sheriff Morrison took the stand last, his face red with shame. "I knew what was happening," he admitted. "I knew Marcus was hurting people, and I did nothing. I told myself it was better to keep the peace than to start a war I couldn't win." "What changed your mind?" the prosecutor asked. Morrison looked at Jacob, then at Elena, then at the crowd of people who'd found their courage in the face of injustice. "I watched a man who couldn't speak stand up for what was right. I watched a woman who had every reason to be afraid choose to fight instead. And I realized that wearing this badge meant nothing if I wasn't willing to protect the people who trusted me." When all the testimony was finished, Judge Waters called for closing arguments. Valdez's lawyer tried to paint his client as a victim of mob justice, but his words rang hollow in the face of so much evidence. The prosecutor's closing was simple and powerful. Justice isn't about the loudest voice or the biggest gun. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood with a piece of paper in his hands. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Jacob sat quietly, feeling something inside his chest that he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Not joy, exactly, but something deeper, a sense that his voice, lost in a Confederate field, had finally been found again. As Valdez was led away in chains, he stopped beside Jacob's seat. "You think this is over?" he whispered. "You think you've won something?" Jacob stood up slowly and looked Valdez in the eye. Then he smiled, not with triumph, but with something that might have been pity. His hand moved to his throat, then to his heart, then toward the crowd of people who'd stood with him. The message was clear. Some victories were bigger than any one man's defeat. Outside the courthouse, Elena found Jacob sitting on the steps, watching the sun set over the mountains. She sat beside him, her children playing in the dusty street below. "What will you do now?" she asked. Jacob pulled out a piece of paper and wrote carefully. "Go home, fix my fence, take care of my animals, live." "That's all?" He wrote again. "Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything." Elena smiled and took his hand. "Would you like company? My children and we need a new start, and I think you could use some noise in that quiet house of yours." Jacob looked at her, surprised by the hope that bloomed in his chest. He'd spent 5 years believing that silence was his destiny, that he was meant to live alone with his scars and his memories. But maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe silence wasn't about being alone. Maybe it was about learning to listen, to see, to understand the things that mattered most. He squeezed her hand gently and nodded toward the horizon, where his small ranch waited under the evening stars. Together, they walked down the courthouse steps and into a future that would be filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the gentle conversation of two people learning to trust again, and the comfortable silence of a man who'd finally found his voice not in words, but in the courage to stand for what was right. The West would remember this day not for the noise of gunfire or the thunder of speeches, but for the quiet strength of a man who proved that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks without words, and the greatest victory is the one that lifts others up instead of tearing them down.